Welcome, and thanks for joining us for our fourth annual Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice in Environmental Data Science speaker series. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Lourdes Vera, our first speaker in this seminar series. I am Juliette Cohen, a data scientist at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. I am joined by the rest of the DEIJ Seminar Series Planning Committee, Amelia, Christina, Justin, Erica, Mona, and Angie. At ENSEES, we work to accelerate scientific discoveries that enhance our understanding of the world and benefit people and nature, as well as transform the scientific culture to be more open, efficient, and collaborative. For more information, check out the ENSEES website. Before we begin, we ask you to join us in acknowledging the Chumash peoples, who are the environmental stewards of the land on which ENSEES is located. We pay our respects to the Chumash peoples and their elders, past, present, and future, who call this place their home. We acknowledge that this land on which we live and work are the traditional homelands of Indigenous peoples, including the Chumash peoples. This land today is the result of the erasures and exclusions of Indigenous peoples. As we come together to bring awareness to issues of equity and justice, we recognize that the Chumash people and so many other Indigenous people are still fighting to dismantle the legacies of settler colonialism in their tribal territories. As we continue to work towards diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in data science, we strive to prioritize Indigenous data sovereignty and self-determination. Now I will introduce you to our speaker for today and give you some logistical information about this presentation. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Lourdes Vera to our DEIJ seminar series. For all of you joining us for this webinar, please feel free to add any questions you may have during the talk through the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. We will have a moderated Q&A section, including these questions at the end of the presentation. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Lourdes Vera is assistant professor in the departments of sociology and environment and sustainability at SUNY University at Buffalo. She holds a PhD in sociology from Northeastern University and is a former high school science teacher. As an environmental sociologist and civic scientist, she works with communities near industrial activity, such as fracking, to monitor their air for contaminants. She also serves in the coordinating committee of the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, envisioning and building digital tools and research infrastructures for environmental data justice. Her interdisciplinary work spans environmental health, social science, and critical theory. Lourdes, we are so excited to have you. Please go ahead.
There's the unmute button. I am so excited to be here too, and especially after meeting a lot of you last year at the annual meeting in Santa Barbara, I realized that the talk was overlapping a little too much in terms of the project, Environmental Enforcement Watch, that I talked about last time. So I updated a bit to add some current work that I'm actually working on in part with Eric Nost, who's here and is going to be talking a couple weeks from now. So thank you for that lovely introduction. And today we will be framing a lot of environmental data problems through the lens of care. And I know a lot of people here are probably familiar with the Indigenous data sovereignty principles of care, and we'll talk about those, but also the feminist ethics of care. And so in order to start with this discussion of care, I want to go through just this general question: what is or are data? And I'm going to be talking about the Palestinian olive trees that are facing destruction and how that destruction and experience of those trees sort of opens a window for us to think about this question. And also to think about, and I'd love to talk during the Q&A about the question of, what's the importance of talking about the meaning of data. And then I'll get into the concept of environmental data justice, which I've introduced to a lot of you before last year at the NCEAS meeting, and go on to give an overview and talk about how I've thought through the United Nations Environmental Program Protected Planet Database, which I'm guessing a lot of ecology folks work with. And then we'll talk about desire-based research and my work with Eric Nost with Environmental Enforcement Watch, and how we are working with communities to build structures for environmental data, and then conclude with mostly Q&A. So what is or are, I'm going to use the singular moving forward, but what is or are data? And I recently was reading the work of my colleague here at University of Buffalo, Iris Braverman, who's an Israeli scholar in the law school and in the Department of Environment and Sustainability. And she's written a book on olive trees and their destruction, as well as attempts towards their protection in the occupied territory of Palestine. And they really give a good example of how data, as Eric and I are arguing in a paper we're currently working on, how data are material, they're embodied, and they're not just abstract representations of things on a map. And as scientists, especially as ecologists, we work with a lot of living data and living things that really have meaning and symbolize or are part of identities. So the olive tree is a symbol of Palestinian identity as well as resilience. Approximately 45% of agricultural land in the occupied Palestinian territories, in particular the West Bank, is dedicated to cultivating 12 million olive trees. And that generates about 25% of gross agricultural income, supporting about 100,000 families. However, there's restrictions on accessing them. So 44 out of 66 barrier gates to these trees are only open during harvest season. About 40% of visitor permit applications are being rejected, and which hinders regular maintenance. So you actually need permits to access these trees. And that reduces a lot of the productivity and connection with the trees. And so Iris Braverman, who's I mentioned is a legal scholar here at UB, she writes about how these trees are being uprooted by a lot of Israeli settlers, and how the Israeli government did take measures to try and protect the trees, but in that effort, the trees became part of the larger bureaucracy and were even surveilled even more. And that's where data really gets into the picture. So they are, continued to be attacked and set on fire. And as this happens, it becomes more and more a symbol of strength and resilience. So I'm going to talk about how the tree itself is data, especially as embodied data, and how it can also be usually we see trees, we map trees, and we see them as symbols on maps. But a media scholar, actually, who is on my dissertation committee, he's at Northeastern University, Dietmar Offenhuber, he just released a book called Autographic Data. And he makes the argument that data is material. It's not just an abstract symbol, but sometimes data includes inscriptions in, for instance, trees. I don't know if there's anyone here who works in dendrochronology, but the actual lines on a tree that shows its age, it contains the data, it is the data, and it visually represents the patterns of the tree's growth. So this data hasn't quite necessarily been collected. You can infer the age of the tree just by looking at it. And that's where we really see that data is material. And here's a collage I made last week. I was really thinking through this. And because we often do think of it as abstract. And so if you see here here's my cursor. So here's tree rings that I found National Geographic in an old computer chip. And I was trying to capture how there's these different ways of managing data and looking at it as digital versus analog, and how those come together when we think about data as actual, magnetic and electric currents that exist on these material computer chips and in trees, and for instance, in bioluminescence and the signals that that luminescence can give out to, for instance, attract prey, or I don't know a lot about fish, but attract prey or mates and so on. So how those signals in the world actually materially exist. And so on the other hand, we have symbolic data, which is how we've usually thought of it and how it is used in occupation, in settler colonialism, and in surveillance. So with the olive trees, you see this is a map from United Nations. I tried to find some maps from the Israeli government, but I couldn't, still on that search. But this shows how they are, the gates are only open to access the trees daily or seasonally. The barriers that are being constructed or will be constructed, where settlements are, and just that through this management of the trees, they are they're managed at certain times of the year and certain times of the day that are being dictated by the state, by the government, and not the people who actually find their identity in the trees and that actually depend on and work with the trees. So this whole top-down versus community-oriented management of land and then of data is an overarching pattern that I'm going to be talking about throughout these three case studies, this whole presentation. And so this brings us to think about data as embodied, right? As actual identity, as memories. And so this is a photograph I found of a Palestinian farmer crying as she was hugging one of the olive trees. And while we have maps from UN and governments that show where the trees are located and the barriers to them on a piece of paper from above, they actually, so a lot of Palestinians see these trees and they mark the history of where villages and homes once stood. So they're actually data in cognitive mapping as well. And for those of us who aren't familiar with cognitive mapping, it's more of an individual experiential way of mapping the world and how one sees it, compared to the more top-down colonial mapping projects that have been used to manage land. And so so my response, or we want to think of the question, then what do we do? How should we look at data? How should we manage data and treat it, especially as our research influences conservation practices and land management? And what does it mean to recognize, say, olive trees or anything that is embodied as vital and vulnerable data? How does that inform our practices? And so part of my answer to this is through feminist ethics of care. And feminist ethics of care refer to, so for data care, a set of practices that seek to foster, preserve, and repair our world by maintaining a network of social relations. So, for instance, valuing the social relations that might be embodied within a tree and the history contained in that. And then also knowing that there's just not one way of seeing the world. There's not just one way of mapping the world. And in all of those ways of seeing and mapping the world, there's power in that. So this is what in feminist studies of science we call situated knowledges, that everyone has a different kind of knowledge that and a different situated stance or background that influences what they know, how they know, and their relations in the world. So research that really incorporates those different kinds of knowledges and values them is taking a step towards repairing the world and maintaining social, good social relations. And this is on the left-hand side. This is just a chart from my work with Environmental Enforcement Watch and our approach towards collaborative data science that folds these things in, right? So we have our actual, Python coding and mapping and visualizing data, but what about the stories? What about the histories and that knowledge? What about the way that we can further contextualize research? And so now this takes us into how we can apply this to more policy-oriented data, and specifically the United Nations Protected Planet Database. And this is where I've thought with some folks on how do we apply environmental data justice, which is influenced by feminist politics of care, into this data, that it also, just like the olive tree maps, it also influences the decisions that policymakers, land managers make in terms of conservation. And our, as scientists, as conservation scientists, our research also, has the potential to inform that sphere. So the data that go into that, they carry power, they are political, and then we want to ask, okay, how can we recognize the identities and the histories and the meanings in this data in a practical way? And I'm going to talk about how there's tensions there. Sometimes you can't be perfect. Sometimes it's not very practical. but we'll get into that. And so environmental data justice now it's very much influenced by the indigenous data sovereignty principles of care, collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And I'll take you through each of those. I also, I don't know if anyone is here from Earth Science Information Partners, but I've been working with some folks there on a paper we just submitted around the care principles and their application and recommendations for people working with repositories. So hopefully that comes out soon. And so that's a very, community-based and just way of working with data that, it's rooted in indigenous self-determination and sovereignty and governance, and is really addressing how states and state data practices have been part of larger colonial projects. And so then, with the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, we've been working on environmental data justice. And similarly, it's a very bottom-up, localized, place-based approach to environmental data, where we emphasize the ethics and data being accessible, but also modifiable and adaptable. For instance, not all data should be open source, right? What if a community doesn't want to be mapped? What if they do not want to be surveilled? It should be a localized and specific form of or process of consent. So how can we apply these principles to protected planet? And this is a very interesting question, because we're also bringing in the role of governance, right? We, just like with the olive trees, we had state intervention actually putting the olive trees and threatening their existence, and through the act of surveilling the olive trees, preventing people from connecting with them. And so here we're also thinking about the role of the state. So the UN, United Nations, is pretty much, they have to, they serve states. And so the different areas, so the states submit data to the United Nations, but you also have tribes submitting data, and there might be some land controversies, some disagreements between a tribe and a state as to, whose land is whose, and what should and can be submitted into this global database versus maybe what is sacred and more private. So then how does a database like this contend with those issues? And some maybe can't be contended with. So here's a more detailed data life cycle that I made. I had a less detailed one on the other slide, but it takes us through the beginnings of the data, where the data come from, how they are managed and stored, verified, what's made accessible, what's not made accessible, how are they disseminated. And so in establishing a more ethical or environmentally just system, there's a lot of questions we have to ask, and some things we can do, and some things we might not be able to do. So I'm going through this from the lens of the care principles, and starting with collective benefit. I know probably all of these stages in the data life cycle could probably relate, but these are the ones that specifically I highlighted to ask these questions for us to think about. So part of collective benefit is inclusive development and innovation, having people involved in the data life cycle from the beginning, from the very first point of collection. And then we have improved governance and citizen engagement. So this is what we've been talking about until, up through here, governance and who is actually engaged in deciding which data are being collected and how they're analyzed. And then what are the outcomes? Are they equitable? So just through here from the beginning, from the capacity building, we have just the question, who do the data affect? Who is represented in the data and whose life is affected by it? And then also across the whole life cycle, who's engaged, whose questions are guiding the analysis, because there's a lot of questions that go unanswered or unasked because there's only certain people at the table. And then also who has access. Some data, some people might not want to be easily accessible, but then other kind of data really should be accessible. So it's the role of the database manager to establish these features, but also, ask through partnerships, through community partnerships, what should be secure, what should be accessible, what shouldn't. And then this goes into authority to control. Who is really, who's controlling the data? In my work doing community-based air monitoring, especially with a tribe, we had a data sharing and ownership agreement where they own the data. And they decided everything that we did with it. And I'm going to say it did not lead to a publication because it's not my role as a researcher to publish when it's another group that owns the data and I'm doing the work for them, with them. So sometimes, so we need to think about, authority to control, whose rights are being recognized, and interests as researchers and interests as communities. And so, especially with the funding, what obligations are attached to this funding? And I brought up that UN is very much accountable to nations. So a lot of what they do are under their obligations to nation states. And so they can't completely revamp their whole database. For instance, how they there's a different process for tribes to submit data versus for nations to submit data. There's a different verification process. And that's why I say, who decides what is valid? Who does the verifying? And who establishes these standards? And this gets really much into the technical nitty-gritty of whose voices are heard in establishing the protocols for metadata, the how submission occurs, which data are accepted, which are not, who's controlling the database, and how secure is it? And then also who's controlling the analysis, and then is there consent before products are disseminated, before research is disseminated? Who do you talk to say, to pass it through and say, hey, does this report look good to you? If you're not, working on it with a community already. And then also responsibility, that these relations, I mentioned before, good relations, that's very much part of feminist ethics of care, that we're building partnerships and positive relations in terms of expanding capacity. So going to the beginning, what is the capacity that we're building? I'm asking the question again, how does the funding bring in these obligations and really shape relationships for better, for worse? And then the sociocultural context, we also are responsible for putting that into metadata. And that's something that we talked a lot about early on in thinking through environmental data justice, is what goes into the metadata and how much attention should we put towards it? Because a lot of data is political. So what is that extra research and political framing, or again, I use the word context, that can be attached to the data and not forgotten, and not forgetting where the data is from. Also, the question, who is responsible for the data, and how do we secure or reject the data? How do we verify it again? How do we, why would we reject certain data and keep others? These kinds of questions. And also, well, going back to who is responsible for the data and stewardship and control, I just want to make the point that I know a lot of researchers really aim to include communities throughout all of the cycle. But for me, it's more of who has a say and who's guiding it versus who's actually doing the work. Because sometimes, so a lot of communities are overburdened and might not want to be part of all of the project. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, that that whoever is affected by this data is part of everything, because they might not have the capacity. So just trying to build, as a researcher, I really focus on trying to help people build capacity so that we can work together, but also keeping the door open, but not thinking that it has to be perfect. It has to be pure. The other final E in care is ethics. And it's just generally similar questions I've been asking. Who did the data affect? How can we minimize harm and maximize benefit? How will data and the data systems we build be sustainable for years, maybe even for generations? What will the data we manage and collect and work with look like 20, 30, 40 years from now? And who will have access moving forward? So I think a really great example of some awesome data practices is, I don't know if anyone has or does work with Exchange for Local Observations and Knowledge of the Arctic, ALOCA. And this is a great collaboration with data scientists and indigenous peoples, and it actually infrastructuring data systems and knowledge systems that includes different types of knowledge and is actually driven and supported by indigenous communities for those communities' benefit. And so my final case study, and I see I have about only a few minutes, and this is my work with Eric Nost. And we have been working on this project, Environmental Enforcement Watch, to connect communities with enforcement data from EPA, which has its issues and its gaps. And I included this picture here of 1970s marina in Buffalo, New York, where I live and where I'm from, with steel plants in the background, because it's places like these that we want to track that are now being regulated by EPA. but it's also that these data do not really capture, and we're trying to work more towards this now, they don't really capture legacy pollution or cumulative impacts. There's so much that is not in it, the history. And so we noticed with the EPA Enforcement and Compliance History Online database that it's very hard to navigate. It does show for, on the interface for the past 3 years, how often a facility has exceeded its permit, how often it's been inspected, and whether there has been penalties on the facility. This is my zip code 14213, and these are, the Bird Island sewage treatment plant here is horrible, and it's owned by the city. So it's useful to have this information, but there's so many gaps with it. And there's also to go back in this interface, you can't find answers to questions like, what are the top 10 polluting facilities in my region? So that's why I'm not going to click on it now. Maybe I can show you during the Q&A, but we created these notebooks in Python through community workshops and partnerships to answer these kinds of questions. So if a community group had a particular question that they couldn't find on the ECHO interface, like what are the top 10 polluters, top 20, what are the top, now we're looking at the different companies, we're starting to do that. What are the top companies that are polluting XYZ? Then we created Python script to answer those questions. And then our website too, environmentalenforcementwatch.org. And here's a meeting with a bunch of folks. This was probably 4 years ago now. But we have a great team now. And at the time, we had some amazing interns that put things together. And so we found a lot of not so encouraging statistics through the use of these notebooks, including that, there are consistent violations of federal environmental laws that often go under the radar, that during the Trump administration, the number of inspections fell to its lowest since 1994, which means less enforcement actions. And then we put out a couple of reports that have to do with the amount of gaps in the data that we found and the amount of violations. So we're in the situation where we are working with and against the data at the same time. And but what I really want to emphasize in this presentation is how we partner or have partnered with communities. And so we had these workshops in the beginning where we presented the notebooks, and we have trained people on how to use the Python notebooks and running them. And one of our interns, Leslie, created this wonderful storytelling part of the workshop where people in a group went through this mural board and told stories about their area and environmental enforcement in their area. And then we also translated these notebooks to Spanish and had a webinar with Spanish-speaking environmental justice activists, and then public hours to go through some of the congressional report cards that we made, which were reports on enforcement in different congressional districts that then people could perhaps take to their Congress people and say, hey, look, this is what environmental enforcement looks like in your area, and it's bad or good. I don't know. Compared to other. So there were a lot of comparisons in those notebooks or in those report cards to state and federal or nationwide levels. And so these are some partners that we're part of the Coming Clean Network. We also partnered with Clean Air Now in Kansas City and Green Roots in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and have done work as part of our science information partners. And then this also goes into the question of civic engagement. So Environmental Enforcement Watch hosted focus group for EPA on the Echo Notify tool, which is their tool to notify the public when there might be a violation, when there's a violation or issues. And then we also did research for a public comment on the permit renewal for some petroleum storage facilities. And then I was doing research on, doing some environmental enforcement research locally when I found that a company was circulating a fake study. So that led to some they still got the subsidies, which is a little ridiculous, but they withdrew their plans to manufacture PVC, polyvinyl chloride, which I think is a little win. So I'm going to end with this slide here, before the final conclusion. And this is where we really started thinking about care. Our Environmental Enforcement Watch co-founder started creating this graphic, and it shows she came up with these different kinds of care, like data care, external care. So for the website, event care, for the workshops that we're planning, research care, how we went through doing our research, and then the coordination within the project. And these are all the people who have been part of that. And so in the end, I bring up the question that I started with. How does recognizing the meaning and the embodiment of environmental data, what does it mean for actual practices? How does this, how can we expand the meaning of data to address data injustice and vulnerability? How do we apply environmental data justice and care to our existing infrastructures, like the Protected Planet database? And then how do we make new infrastructures like I know we're using, old data from EPA, or already established data infrastructures, but we're making new infrastructures with the notebooks, with community input. And then where can we go from there, especially with the newer data that we collect in our research as we move forward? And that's that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lourdes. There is applause in the MC lounge from our audience here in Santa Barbara. But we really appreciate you sharing this presentation with us. It was fascinating. And I think it'll generate a lot of interesting conversation here. So if you have attendees, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section, and we'll get to those in order. But I'll just start with one question that we have for you, and that is, you've talked about a lot of different strategies for incorporating these principles of care into research and collaboration with communities. And you mentioned a little bit about the potential results that can have in equitable policies and things like that. But I'm curious what your vision is for the next 5 years, perhaps 10 years. What will this look like down the line if we're successful?
Well, it depends on who's elected in 2024. Wait, that's this year. So I think, so if we're, that's such a good question. And I think about it as, especially in terms of our grassroots work to, and my grassroots community air monitoring work, and how we, in terms of data management and analysis, how we're starting sort of from ground zero, or is that the term? From square one. And this past year, over these couple of years, there's been a lot of digital dashboards that have popped up. I actually just submitted a grant application to make one. But we keep seeing them, and there's some amazing examples like the new fencelinedata.org and Pittsburgh. There's one from Pittsburgh where people can submit their experiences and their smells. And so I see moving forward, how do we create infrastructures that are not reinventing wheels, but adaptable to various places? And it's really exciting what's happening. And I think we can make these community tools no matter who is elected. So, what's happening outside of bipartisan politics and state governance for us to really, we're really taking control of data we collect, but also making them, I just hope for some more legitimacies, for it to be seen as legitimate. I see the questions now.
Oh, good. Thank you. Well, I think I'd like to start with a question here that says, what do you think is the best way to introduce this data justice approach to young scientists? Is it happen in first year college STEM classes, sooner than that? What's the best time to introduce those?
I just gave a wonderful workshop to high school 10th graders through a Women in Science and Engineering initiative here at UB. And I took them through the notebooks, through the Environmental Enforcement Watch notebooks. And it was I think it was a great way to approach it, because it was hands-on. I feel like the younger they are, the less intimidated they are by anything. So they just went for it, for running the code, and then through that discovered a lot of political issues, so data issues, and then local political issues, like with the sewage treatment plant. And then we looked up how the mayor hired his son to run it, and talked about nepotism, and talked about how there was only 3 years of the data. So just having those very specific case studies and local references for them was very helpful.
Great, thank you. Next, can you talk more about implementing care in repositories and the status of guideline publications coming out, or existing guidelines for repositories?
Yeah, so I worked with some folks at Earth Science Information Partners, and I can post the link to the paper. We did put up the manuscript that has been submitted, and with Stephanie Carroll's research group at University of Arizona on how to manage repositories, with very specific recommendations. So a lot of what I was going through during the presentation too, like forming community partnerships, relationships, translating a lot of material and metadata into various languages. There's a lot. So I will post the link or send it out, and hopefully, I'm I'm very excited about it. So
Great. Yeah, if you can include it in the chat.
yeah.
If not, we can send it out to attendees after the webinar. And then we have one more question from someone asking, when thinking about remote sensing data like satellite imagery, how do you think would be the best way for including communities since the beginning of the data cycle in collecting data, for instance? Or do you have any comments on the just use of remote sensing data with care principles?
That's something I wonder about a lot too. I know, and then also, because remote sensing is also, oh, I was going to say it's a broad term, but satellite imagery is not. So I think, I mean, we live in a world, especially in a Google Street View world, even though now you can blur yourself out, where we are going to be surveilled by satellite, even, whether it, whether it's happening or it's going to happen. And then the question is about consent, right? So, of course, having the community be part of a data cycle from the beginning, but what if it's the whole world? I don't know, but I am a fan of what NASA's been doing with their Unbound workshops. And they've been training environmental justice communities and nonprofit organizations in accessing and using the satellite data. So I think by focusing at least on, asking a question, what should be accessible, what shouldn't, how do we engage with people who are affected by this data is a good start. But it also goes to my comment when I was discussing the protected planet database is that, nothing can be pure. Nothing can be purely ethical. A lot of it is very, very much in a gray area. We can only just work towards that.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And so you spoke about expectations that come attached to funding, and that sort of those can be opportunities and restrictions. But so what do you recommend researchers can do to implement care principles when those expectations from funding sources are not always aligned with care principles?
Well, I think that the first thing that we really should always do is, even before applying for the grant, is involve anybody who might be affected by the data we collect and work with for that grant, to involve them. And that doesn't always happen. So it's, in looking for the funding source, thinking about where it's coming from, whether it's a no strings attached or low strings attached grant versus what if it's industry funding. But sometimes even I'm just thinking Health Effects Institute, they have a lot of funding that's coming from oil and gas industry, but they also have environmental justice activists that they're consulting with and communities are consulting with, funding these projects that are, connecting health effects with, say, fracking. So just, looking into those funding sources and see what the report, the obligations are for reporting. And also knowing that sometimes, and I mentioned that too, sometimes publications, or just having your funder recognized, depending on who you're working with, that sometimes it might not be published.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we're just about out of time, but we appreciate your presentation so much. Thanks for kicking off our 2024 DEIJ seminar series.
Yeah.
And we are looking forward to presentations for the next 2 weeks, next Thursday and the Thursday after that. So we look forward to having you back, having attendees join us for those. And we'll be sure to follow up with the link to that manuscript that you mentioned.
I got it.
Is it in
Yeah.
the, is it
Wait,
in the
I
chat?
added it as an answer and then I just put it
Oh,
in, but
great.
it says that this is going to the hosts and panelists.
Gotcha. Yes. So we'll save that link and we'll make sure that attendees have access to that as well. Thank you so much, Lourdes.
All right, thank you.